Welcome back to another episode of What's Going On, a social studies at work podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and this is a podcast where we talk about different topics in the social studies field.
Today we're talking about student activism.
Well, Maeve, I was looking at the news earlier this week, and I was looking at all the protests surrounding Trump's new immigration laws and policies. We see that there's been a lot of student walkouts and protests, especially from the Latino community all across the country, but especially in California and LA. This is interesting because even though we're seeing these students protest these laws regarding immigration, we see that this is students specifically and not just the general public. This is something that relates to education very strongly. I think one of the reasons that is because if students don't feel safe knowing that maybe their parents or they may get deported, they can't have the opportunity to have a good education, to feel safe in their schools or any of that. We see that this came to be very prominent, especially on the day without immigrants on February 3rd, where many students just didn't go to school as a form of protest. Did you hear anything about that?
Yes, I have been keeping up with that in the news. I found it especially interesting how certain policies from Trump's immigration plan involve institutions like ICE going into schools and kind of like disrupting that safety that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this fits in very well, like what you said, with student-led protests, which is our topic for today, student activism.
Mm-hmm.
So protests, especially by students, have existed as long as schools have existed.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we talked about while we were doing research that I had found a funny story about how Harvard students back in the 18th century started a protest about disgusting butter. And so while that's a funny example, we've also seen examples more recently. By recently, I'm thinking of the 70s surrounding protests for Vietnam, specifically the Kent State protest, which eventually turned into the Kent State Massacre on May 4th, 1970. And in relation, the protest was turned into a court case of Tinker versus Des Moines in 1965, also related to Vietnam, where students tried to protest, and there was an argument about First Amendment rights, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Moving more towards the present, there was a big protest back in 2019 after the Parkland Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting back in 2018, where students all over the country walked out of their classrooms to protest gun violence. And even as recently as last year, as what we've seen on our campus here at the university, of pro-Palestine encampments on many universities across the country, but specifically at Columbia University, where it started, to protest against the war going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's interesting how you've mentioned all these different examples, and we see it's not just one demographic. We see it go across universities and high schools and just many general protests, because these issues aren't just things that affect one demographic, one age group, but it affects different age groups, and every student wants to get the opportunity to speak up for what they believe in.
I think that's very human, wanting to speak our minds and fight for what we believe is right. And we see that especially in students as they come into themselves.
Yeah, and it's very nice to see how empowered these students are, especially in high schools or maybe even middle schools, being able to do this, because many times, like in the Vietnam War, we associate the protests with university students, but university students are almost like adults, even like growing into that. But high schoolers, they're still regarded kind of as kids, but they do have opinions and worldviews that they feel passionate enough to share.
Yeah, well, we do, like you said, see a lot of those protests in universities. We shouldn't disregard students in even elementary, middle, and high school who feel that they have the right to speak their mind and want to talk about a cause.
And the rise of these movements and the relevancy that they're gaining in the media, what do you think is a teacher's role or place when it comes to student activism and protest? Teachers.
I think this is definitely an interesting question, because when we talk about student movements, we don't necessarily discuss, like, what is the role of the teacher in these certain types of situations. And it can really depend on where you are, like district to district and even school to school. What does the teacher do in these kinds of situations? We've been looking into it, and I found different answers, from what a teacher can do, like legally, to what a teacher should do in the classroom in these situations. The consensus around like what can the teacher do legally, I found a lot that the priority for teachers is student safety. It is the teacher's priority to make sure that students stay safe. And so this can mean following the students where they go. In a situation like a walkout, if all of the students leave the classroom, the teacher must follow the students to provide support and supervision on the students. However, students do decide to stay in the classroom, the teacher must stay with the students. I've also seen a lot that teachers are encouraged not to participate in the protests that are occurring. This is mostly surrounding middle and high school students, K through 12 students. When movements happen, it's best for teachers to be supervisors and facilitators. I found an interesting point that it is the job of the teacher to listen. And I think that's a very powerful point when discussing student movements and what is the role of the teacher.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that teachers are often tasked with the responsibility of keeping students safe, right? But they also have that encouragement to listen to them and see maybe what they want to do, where they're at, all of that. And I think it's interesting because these teachers are often stuck in the middle between students and their institution, because institutions often want to keep things like in a status quo, maintain the normal flow of things, but students in the occasions of protest often want things to change. So teachers are kind of like in that in between, and they have to juggle their responsibilities as a teacher, but also perhaps their personal beliefs or connections with their students.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Teachers, like any other citizen of the United States, do have that freedom of speech and right to protest and assembly. It does get a little tricky, though, because there are kind of limits to what teachers can do when they're protesting, especially during the times that they're supposed to be a teacher and not in their off time, right? Because many times the institutions or schools that they work for often want them to stay neutral about certain political issues. So it does kind of muddy their freedom in protesting and engaging with students and their activism.
Mm-hmm.
I think hopping onto your point, or our point, that teaching is political, I feel like protesting and activism and kind of that social justice work, it is going to come up if you're teaching your students to be critical, to be aware, to be kind to one another. As teachers, you want students to be active in their community and get involved when they can. I think the only limitation that there would be for that is telling them what specifically to advocate for. Mm-hmm. You have to equip them to recognize those things and see what they think, so that they can take the skills that you give them and be able to apply them in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like we were kind of talking about earlier, it's the teacher's job to listen. We're not really there to say, this is what you should protest, this is what you should not. That's not our job. And we, as much as we want to encourage students to see what they want to see in the world and what they want to change. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we keep saying that teaching is political, or maybe even a form of activism, but why do you think that is? Why isn't it just teaching?
Mm-hmm. This is something I don't really have the answer to yet with my limited experience in the classroom. I do believe once I have more hands-on experience, I might be able to answer this question a little better. From personal experience, from talking with other prospective teachers, I've talked to many who go into the profession wanting to make a change in the world, to make a change on the students, which is a very interesting point when you think about becoming a teacher. Becoming part of activism and politics isn't really something you consider until you start getting into the field and you realize, oh, this is so entwined with politics, with activism. And you don't even realize you're doing it until you're standing with your students and trying to make a difference.
Yes. Something that we study a lot in our education classes is different topics on diversity, accessibility, all that, kind of accepting all of our students and being the best teacher that we can to them. But I think a lot of the limits that these education courses take is that they always focus on what's inside the classroom and not what's outside.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're saying, teaching is political, and it's because we can recognize these students' problems just can't all be fixed inside the classroom. You also have to think about what's outside of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's kind of political, and it's an act of activism to recognize that you have to do more than just accept students and welcome them, but also do the work into helping these systematic problems outside of the classroom, so that these students don't have to face them at all. As an effort to kind of bridge students' personal lives and who they are in the classroom, many times we often go to bringing in material that is representative of them and their culture. You look at the demographics of your school and you bring in as many different sources so that each student can feel represented in some way, so they can see their struggles reflected in your curriculum. Still, it's important to think about, should you bring in conversations and topics about types of activism or systems of oppression, even if those students may not face those problems?
In my personal opinion, I believe, yes, that we should be doing that. Like we've been talking about, the world outside the classroom doesn't stop turning when the student walks in. Those systems of oppression that maybe they don't face still happen. To ignore them, to not teach them, is almost like saying it doesn't exist and therefore it doesn't matter, which is definitely not the case. And like we've kind of been talking about, just because we're discussing these forms of activism in the classroom doesn't mean we're asking our students to go outside and chain themselves to a tree for climate change. When we talk about them, these forms of activism, these examples of activism, it's more of to bring awareness to them that this is going on, and to give them almost a sense of solidarity that their struggles, they're not struggling alone.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Even though you might think that maybe your students are uninterested in types of oppressions that they aren't facing because they won't see themselves reflected in it directly, they might also see themselves connected to that struggle indirectly. They might feel, like you said, a sense of solidarity or sense of awareness that even though they're facing one specific struggle in one way, that there are other types of struggles that they may relate to, and that it's important to acknowledge these, because like you said, not teaching them or kind of ignoring them does do a disservice to students, and it can be harmful because they don't see the biases that they're gaining, you know. I think that when students see that their struggles are similar to other people's struggles, they can really group together, and if there ever was a need for an act of activism or protest or walkout, there's more strength in that, because you can call on your allies to stand up for you as you would stand up for them.
The last thing we want to do as teachers is to create a sort of other mentality, to make students feel that they are alone in their struggles and that there's this other out there that's not going to have their back. We want to bring all types of students together.
I think an important part of building that empathy and partnership is teaching with justice. One of the pillars of that is diversity, and it's expressing curiosity about other people, their lived experiences, and their histories. And being able to exchange your own experiences, histories, and all that with other people so you can connect with them in that way. Some other pillars that we see in teaching for justice is prioritizing identity, justice, and action. I think specifically for our topic, we want to focus on justice and action, and that entails recognizing the struggles that other people have, the power dynamics that they're in with institutions and systems of oppression, and deciding to do something about it. We have a responsibility to not be a bystander, but to stand up for other people and stand up to exclusion, prejudice, and injustice.
Exclusion, prejudice, and injustice are things that we see in systems of oppression all of the time. And it's not without recognizing that the school is and it's not without recognizing where our school system fits in systems of oppression, because it is a system of oppression where injustice happens every day. And it is so common for students, teachers, and all alike to feel small and almost as just a number in a machine. And so we have to ask ourselves, what can we as teachers do to make sure our students don't feel small and insignificant?
Yeah, part of that, getting students feeling empowered, I think, is trying to build like an alliance with these students, recognizing that even though teachers do have like that intimidating position of having to teach the students, you can still be partners, and many times you're often on the same side of being like under systems and institutions. When teachers speak out and when students speak out, they often face similar risks that come with that type of activism. Students, for example, they always face the risk of detention, of expulsion, or any other type of punishment that comes with walking out or not going to school, things like that. But teachers also face similar risks. They might be fired, they might be put on leave, or they might face more harsher punishments. So as a teacher, you often have the opportunity to act as a model to students and showing your strength and resilience, choosing to speak up and live your truth in a way. Even in the face of all these threats, you decide to still speak out.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing teachers can do maybe inside the classroom is something we've touched on a lot. It's kind of like our segment, is teaching with hope. And what we mean by teaching with hope is making sure that we don't leave students with that sense of helplessness, with that sense of feeling small. This could be bringing in examples of when activism has been successful or when changes have been made in either the school system or in the world in general.
I think a great part of that also comes in instilling a sense of curiosity and resilience. Seeing that, like we've been saying over and over, they're not alone. And if they can turn to their peers and find strength in them, they can realize they don't have to always be this strong, independent person, that they're always part of a community that they can rely on. A strong part of building that community often comes with what, like you said, listening to others, and sometimes even accepting that discomfort that may come from listening to others. Sometimes we have to recognize that we have our biases, that sometimes we hurt people without even realizing it. So we have to own up to it and try to get involved with other people as open-mindedly and willing as we can. Something that I want to end off with is a quote by Margaret J. Wheatley from her book Turning to One Another. It is directed towards educators and how to be better leaders, how to make a change in the world. She says, "Sometimes we hesitate to listen for differences because we don't want to change. We're comfortable with our lives, and if we listen to anyone who raised questions, we'd have to get engaged with changing things. If we don't listen, things can stay as they are, and we won't have to expend any energy. But most of us do see things in our lives or in the world that we would like to be different. If that is true, we have to listen more, not less, and we have to be willing to move into the very uncomfortable place of uncertainty."
This has been another episode of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and remember to take care and stay aware.